If we could have your attention, we'll get started. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We are launching and introducing our Witness Stone project to the community, and we're really grateful that you're here with us tonight. Wanted to say a special thanks to the middle school teachers, Pam and Tracy. Are they here? They're there. And also to the Longmeadow Historical Society and just the collaborative effort between the schools and these organizations and our church have really helped us to make this happen and to begin the project. And to Dennis Culleton, who is our speaker tonight and also the founder and director of the Witness Stone Project. We're here essentially to remember the history and to honor the humanity of enslaved people from Longmeadow. It's a history that our church discovered through the diaries of Stephen Williams, our first pastor, who was the first pastor starting over 300 years ago, 307 years if I understand correctly. And he wrote so much about day-to-day life that this is where the history that we're talking about got revealed in a profound way. I want to say another special welcome to State Senator Jake Oliveira and State Representative Brian Ash, and also to recognize that part of the reason we're able to do all that we're going to be doing with the middle school especially is through a Mass Humanities grant that has made this possible. So we're really grateful to our leaders who helped make that happen, and glad that you're here with us tonight as well. Dennis has been here all day. He worked with the teachers today at the high school for quite a while, the middle school and some high school teachers. And I was able to introduce myself to them as well. And I shared with them that our motto as a church is striving to be a church that the world needs today. And I think in a lot of ways our focus is on the future, but in order to have a future as a church, you need to acknowledge your past and acknowledge some of the painful things that have existed in our past. And for us, our church history is early American history. And part of that early American history has to do with slavery and the original sin of America, which is largely racism. So we lift this time up to you and hope you really enjoy hearing from Dennis tonight. And on your seats when you came in are little cards that explain two events coming up related to the Witness Stone Project. Is it April or April? Yeah, that I should have brought one of those up with me. We have what we call a meeting house lecture, and it's actually somebody highly connected with the Witness Stone Project, Patricia Wilson Phineas. And her talk is called Finding, Celebrating, and Teaching America's Hidden History. She personally benefited from the good work that Dennis has done in finding her own heritage and family history. And she has a powerful story to tell. And then on May 29th at 9:30 a.m., there will be a ceremony at First Church in Longmeadow where our first two witness stones will be unveiled and presented to the children and young people who attend the middle schools in town. So we're really looking forward to that. The community's welcome at both of those events as well. And again, big round of applause for Dennis. And
so what a great crowd to have here tonight. I was stuck with teachers all day, so I apologize. But I just want to say we're not going to be, the students are going to be telling the stories of Peter and Phyllis, and these are the people the students will be memorializing through the good work of the historical societies and the curriculum that we've developed. So tonight is going to be maybe a little bit different lesson. And I have to warn you, I was an 8th grade history teacher, so it's going to be about 42 and a half minutes, and the bell's going to ring. But I want you to stay after and ask questions. And if you see a slide and you're really desperate to say, I need to ask a question now, please do so. And you know, it's not that big of a crowd, we can't do that. But, so the Witness Stones Project is about learning the hard history of slavery in the North. When done best, it's done in a community where we're partnering with the schools, the historical societies, churches, anti-racist groups and groups. And your church has both, you know, has a religious and looks towards the anti-racist group. We met, some of us met, maybe was it 2 years ago or a while ago in Suffield to talk about the project, where they've been doing the project there probably for about 4 or 5 years. One of the things we need to understand, you know, I grew up in Massachusetts. You can tell a little, when I hear myself recorded, I sound like Cliff Clavin. It sounds a little bit. But I grew up in Southbridge. It's like Holyoke where they park the cars side by each, if you know the reference. But I didn't know about this stuff. I knew about Massachusetts and colonial and the houses you might see in your town is because people were selling hay to each other. They talked about subsistence farming and strange things like that. These places weren't settled for subsistence farming. They were settled for people to make money. Yes, there were religious separatists. Yes, there were other reasons people left. But the names that were big in town during the founding were people who came here with some shillings in their pocket. And they were investors, and they were hoping to make money. And that goes all the way up and down the Connecticut River. I live near the mouth of the Thames River, near New London. Same thing up and down the Thames River, and where goods were coming from central Massachusetts down to Norwich or across to Boston to be put on ships and mainly to trade with the people in the West Indies. Why did the people in the West Indies want to trade with us? Because they were making so much money on sugar and molasses that they didn't want to go fishing. They had already cut down all the trees. They needed lumber. They didn't want to raise animals, farm animals. It was cheaper for them to buy beef and pork and lambs from us, or mutton, than it was to raise it themselves because they could make a lot of money. And even today in the world, there are countries that have like one commodity, like oil or something, and they buy everything else from everybody else. Well, that was what was happening in the West Indies. We learn about the triangle trade, but we don't learn about the centrality of the West Indies trade and the brutality of what the West Indies trades cause. There were more enslaved people brought to these little islands in the West Indies than all the American colonies because they were somewhat working them to death or working them so hard that they weren't reproducing, and they were the ones producing the sugar and molasses. So that's what a lot of what we were doing here. And then things from Massachusetts, sometimes, especially things like rum and iron products, were going to Africa to buy enslaved people, to bring them to the West Indies, and some of them were brought here later. Pressed the wrong button. So here's specific details. You know, we can talk about this stuff, but luckily there has been published recently from a dissertation by Dr. Eric Bartholomew Kimball. He looked at the customs reports coming out of Massachusetts, coming out of Boston and Salem and Marblehead. We know Salem and Marblehead's a little north of Boston. And look at the things that they were sending from there to the West Indies. Now, the West Indies is surrounded by fish, right? If you go down there now, they're serving you locally, you know, harvested fish. But what were they eating? What were they serving their enslaved people? They were serving them bacalao, salted codfish. They were serving them food from the North Atlantic. And it doesn't make too much sense that something that was off the coast of Nova Scotia was being dried on the shores of Maine or Massachusetts and being shipped to the West Indies, but that's the truth. And even today, one of the staples, one of the, you know, kind of holiday meals down in the West Indies is bacalao or salted codfish. But we're also sending pine boards, sending candles. Candles are made from fat, either whale oil or tallow, stuff from beef or pork fat. Beef and pork, barrels and staves. What were the barrels and staves being used for? To make barrels and put the molasses and sugar in. Bread and flour, horses and shingles, whale oil, cattle. That stuff's from Boston. If you look from Marblehead and Salem, pretty much the same things, except more fish, because that's further north, closer to the Georges Banks and places where people are fishing. So these are things that are leaving Massachusetts to the West Indies. This is a graph showing where the stuff is going to. So if things are being exported from Marblehead or Salem, 16% is going to the other 13 colonies. 4.3% to Canada, less than 3% to Britain, 22% to Europe, but 46% of the things coming out of that part of Massachusetts was going to the West Indies. So think about how great of an amount that is compared to everything else people were doing. And if we look at Boston, yes, there was more things going to the other colonies, but still 25% of everything out of Boston was going to the West Indies. To me, that wasn't in my textbooks. I don't think it was in your textbooks. How many people knew just some of this before? Some of you. So these are things that we're helping social studies teachers today understand how our economy was complicit with slavery. Now, some of you might be scratching your head thinking, aren't we shipping stuff up and down the Connecticut River? Yes, you are. But first, we'll finish in Massachusetts. 1/3 of everything out of Massachusetts was going to the West Indies. The trade with the West Indies, the trade with the folks who were using an awful form of slavery to make a boatload of money, was mainly coming out of here. Not to mention our southern colonies that were also using labor of enslaved men and women to make a profit. So, yes, we did send things up and down the Connecticut River. And if we look here, we can look at New Haven and New London. Those were the two customs houses in Connecticut. If you know the geography of Connecticut, if you go down the Connecticut River, you take a left, you're in New London, and you take a right, you're in New Haven. 3 out of every 4 horses to the West Indies came from Connecticut, 27,000 sheep, 4.5 million pounds of beef and pork. That was beef on the hoof and beef in the barrel. That was pork on the hoof, and we can say pork on the hook. You know, hams, you think of the hams that were hanged, the dried hams, the sausages, but that's what was being sent to the West Indies. Butter and cheese. Well, we talk about our dairy farms. We sometimes brag. I don't know if does Longmeadow still have a dairy farm? No. When I was a kid, that's what football players did in the summers. You helped them bale hay, right? So you get the muscles. But butter and cheese are ways of preserving milk. You get milk, and within a day or so, you pretty much have to process it. Or if you don't use it, it's going to spoil. So you make butter and cheese. So all the excess, all the surplus, or people were purposely making butter and cheese to put on vessels to send to the West Indies. Now, I'm a leave butter out guy, so you might be married to somebody who's a put butter in the refrigerator person, and it's hard if you have a mixed marriage like that. But butter, I believe butter can last out, especially in the hold of a ship in the springtime going to the West Indies. So that butter is still good when it gets to the West Indies. Tallow, of course, is made from beef fat and pork fat. Tallow can be used for candles. It can be used for soap. It can be used for lubricant. So tallow was an important byproduct of butchering the cattle and the pigs to send meat down, but it was also a byproduct for that. And also tallow can be used as a preservative. So these are things that are going to the West Indies. These are things that are being brought in. 1.5 million pounds of brown sugar, over 500,000 gallons of molasses, only 1,300 gallons of rum. And we asked the teachers this, and some of them knew this, right? Why is there so little rum being brought in from the West Indies? We made it here, right? We had distilleries in our cities, Middletown, Hartford. I'm sure Springfield had distilleries. We were taking the sugar and molasses, the raw materials, and turning it into something more precious, which was rum. And some of that rum was going on ships and being sailed to Africa to trade for enslaved people. We did need some salt. This part of Massachusetts, you're not going to get a lot of salt. So we needed to bring in salt. What was the salt for? The codfish, the hams, the cheese. And in growing up working on dairy farms, we had salt licks. The cows would lick the salt, drink more water, produce more milk. So we needed a lot of salt up here. Well, we can see overall, again, the imports from the West Indies to Connecticut, 54% of all tonnage in New Haven and 46% of all tonnage into New London. Again, it's the most important trading partner we have are the West Indies. And part of some of the issues we had in this country all the way through the War of 1812 is we weren't picky who we traded with. If you're from New England, you trade with the British Isles and the Dutch Isles and the French Isles and occasionally the Spanish Isles. So we were trading with different colonial governments down there. There's been a lot of work done on slavery, especially recently. There's a lot of it's online, but there's still some really good books out there. If you're from Connecticut or you get the Hartford Courant, about 20 years ago, they did this whole series on Connecticut and slavery. They started by looking at the insurance companies and saying, or were the insurance companies involved with slavery? The answer was yes, and. It was yes, and everybody else. And that's what these authors, Ann Farrell, Joel Lang, and Jennifer Frank, found out about Connecticut. But there's so they wrote this down, and it's a pretty accessible book. If you want to read about New England, it talks about how the North promoted, prolonged, and profited from slavery. It is a little Connecticut-centric, but it is a very good book. In the middle, there's a book about Eastern Long Island. Some of you might know that was part of New England back in the day, and how people there were trading with the West Indies. And on the right is probably the most current book by Christy Clark Bajara about slavery in Rhode Island. Rhode Island had two big occurrences associated with slavery. One, they had these really big plantations where they were growing horses and cattle and sheep. And the other is that Newport and Bristol were the centers of the slave trade in the colonial period. So we go to Newport today and we look at all those big houses on the hill. Those weren't the houses associated with slavery. It was the ones down by the waterfront. You see these big 3-story colonials with a captain's name on it. Those are the ones that were associated with slavery then. Some more evidence. This is part of the basis, part of the way the project started. As an 8th grade teacher, I always wanted to tell the stories in my social studies class, starting in the community I lived in. The community I lived in, Guilford, Connecticut, was the childhood home of Harriet Beecher Stowe's mother and father, Lyman Beecher and Roxana Foote. And I started wanting to tell the story about Harriet Beecher Stowe from the community where she lived after her mother died in Litchfield. She came back to live with her grandmother in Guilford. And when I got there, I started finding enslaved people in her household. So if you've read or studied Harriet Beecher Stowe, they'll say, oh, she first was exposed to slavery when her father took a position at the Lane Seminary in Cincinnati, and she went across the river to Kentucky and she saw enslaved people. That's not true. There were enslaved people in her grandmother's household in Guilford, Connecticut. And when I found that, I was like, oh, this is shocking to me. How would Harriet Beecher Stowe benefit from slavery before she wrote the book about slavery and about ending slavery? So, but the more I looked, the more things we found. But just to keep on the theme of Harriet Beecher Stowe for a second, her grandfather lived in Guilford. He rented enslaved people. And he also traded with the West Indies. So this book, this piece of paper is kind of a ship's manifest where he's keeping accounts of all these people who've given to him on consignment things like beef and tallow, bushels of corn and oats, 4,600 red oak barrel staves, pressed hay, horses, oxen, culling staves. So these are all items listing with the names of the people who gave them to him to sell in the West Indies. Now his job wasn't to sell them for that price. His job was to make a profit off of each of them. But when he came back, this is what he owed them. And when a vessel went to the West Indies, it wasn't like they went to one port. They would go to Jamaica and then sail around the island, stopping at each port, trying to sell and buy things. They would go to maybe Martinique or Guadeloupe or some other island, Barbados, and do the same thing until they sold everything they wanted to sell, or they brought back everything they wanted to bring back. And we can see here, this is a better printout of it, but you can see the top, it says, the third one down, to half a Simeon Chittenden, his oxen, to Thomas Griswold's oxen, to Jabez Benton's ox, deducting hide and tallow. So I guess they must have butchered the ox if they're deducting hide and tallow. It talks about 8 gallons of rum, which was probably for the crew, and 10.5 quarts of rum for people loading the ship. So you can see rum was also a lubricant for the sailors in those days. But that's what he went. We don't see the results. We didn't get the piece of paper, but we know that that Eli Foote, Harriet's grandfather, went back and forth to the West Indies many times, and he ended up dying in North Carolina when he was trading with enslavers there. So we have these records to show us, like, specifically what were people bringing there and what were they bringing back. Now, I'm going to take a sip for a second. Is there any questions about the West Indies trade and what people were doing here? I think Melissa's from the Historical Society, was saying that people had ships right here.
Hello. I'm Melissa Sapolsky. I'm from the Long Meadow Historical Society. Yes, we are right here in Long Meadow. We're right on the Connecticut River, and one of our town's wealthiest merchants, Merchant Samuel Colton, owned two ships, the Friendship and the Speedwell, and they were right here, right in Long Meadow on the Connecticut River. So. And one of where they went was they did the triangle trade, West Indies, Boston, England, etc. That is not that we have seen. He himself was an enslaver, but we have not yet found any evidence of people.
Well, there is, and we haven't gotten to it yet, but most of the time in New England, there wasn't a ship that arrived with 200 enslaved people. It was a ship that came with sugar and molasses and spices and maybe some citrus and some enslaved people. So if you see when a ship comes in Boston, you see an advertisement that'll list all these things that they are bringing with them and a likely Negro girl. So it's kind of like a continuation of the slave trade where many of the enslaved people went from Africa to the West Indies, and then some of those from the West Indies were brought here. No, but we do have one of the people who wrote Complicity wrote something called Logbooks that talks about Connecticut people going to Africa and bringing back slaves. We know there was a slave auction or a slave market in Middletown that enslaved people, Middletown, Connecticut, where enslaved people were brought that far up the river and sold there. But we didn't have, it wasn't like Charleston, that's correct. Charleston is a whole, you know, we had, there's a speaker that, Professor Hassan Kwame Jeffries from Ohio State University, and he talks about slavery being, there's no good slavery, but there's worse and worser. So some places it was worser is what he would say. His brother is a guy named Hakeem Jeffries. I don't know if you heard of him. Yeah, so that's Hassan Jeffries. What a pair of people. And he's a great speaker, and he talks a lot about this. I've been able to co-present with him, I think in Suffield, with the independent school teachers, and it's an amazing person. We want to look at slavery in Massachusetts. Massachusetts slavery really was jump-started with the Pequot War. Now, the Pequot War happened in Connecticut. Connecticut wasn't overly established at the time, so it was really New England colonies. And the Pequots were an indigenous people who lived in what is now southeastern Connecticut. They weren't getting along with the colonial people. It really, you know, was like, and there was a lot of tit for tat going on, so finally the colonists said, we're going to go take them out. So they went down to what is now Mystic, Connecticut, and wiped out a village and attacked them at night with other indigenous people and burned the place to the ground. And the indigenous people will call it the Pequot Massacre, and the colonial people said the Pequot War. But afterwards, Connecticut wanted to dissolve the Pequot Nation. And they said, you can't even use the term again. And they divided up the indigenous people. So the women were given, it said, I'll see if I can read it. Here our men gat some booty of kettles, trays, wampum, and the women and children were divided. So the women and children were given as kind of gifts or as booty from the, to the soldiers who fought. And the higher rank you had, the more enslaved women you would get. And then they said that they had slain or taken about 700 of the Pequots. We sent 15 boys and 2 women to Bermuda by Mr. Pierce. But he, missing it, carried them to Providence Island. So you notice a date. This is a guy named John Winthrop. This is John Winthrop the Elder. He's kind of one of the founders of New England. His son, John Winthrop the Younger, was one of the founders of Connecticut. And this is 1637. 1638, Mr. Pierce and Salem ship, the Desire, returned from the West Indies after 7 months. He had been at Providence and brought some cotton, tobacco, and Negroes, etc., from thence, and salt from the Tortugas. Dry fish and strong liquors are the only commodities for those parts, pretty much saying if you're going to go sell stuff there, rum and salted fish. He met there 2 men of war set forth by the lords, etc., of province with letters of mart. I think that's letters of marque, which were like licenses to be a pirate. If you know the letters of marque allowed like British, sailors or merchantmen to attack Spanish ships, who had taken diverse prizes from the Spaniards and many Negroes. So this is the beginning of African enslavement here in New England. We are now finding in Connecticut that the Dutch had a little outpost there, and they called it New Hope. It's otherwise known as Hartford, and that there were an African enslaved people there too. So the Dutch certainly were enslavers of Africans early and often. In Connecticut, we see this idea of indigenous servitude. We have to remember that the word servant is a euphemism for a slave or enslaved person. So it says, this guy named Governor Lead, he was the last governor of New Haven Colony and the second governor of Connecticut Colony. He said, "We have taken and hired some Mohegan Indians, that other Indians do live as servants unto me for planting corn and cutting wood." So this is 1660. The Mohegans especially also benefited from the destruction of the Pequot Nation, and they gained a lot of new tribal members as enslaved people and others. So it looks like they paid some Mohegans to bring enslaved indigenous people to him. It's not always easy to understand what you're seeing here, but when we see the word servant, most cases, or like 99% of the cases, if they're talking about people of color, they're enslaved people. I want to talk just a little bit about terminology. All the books, all the old records, the term is slave. We're now beginning to try to use the term enslaved persons. It doesn't always fit, and it doesn't always come out of my mouth the way I want it to, but the way I try to remember it is my daughter has a seizure disorder. She has epilepsy. My daughter is not an epileptic. My daughter is Hope. She has a seizure disorder. People are not, if we believe either in the scriptures or we believe in our nation's founding documents that all men are created equal, or all men and women are created equal, then enslaving someone is an act. It's taking away something. So we try to use that. We don't try to beat people up if they use the term slave or browbeat them or anything, but we try to use the proper language or language that means what we feel or what we think. So an enslaved person is that, but if you read anything before 2012, it's going to say slave instead of enslaved person. We do have transitions even here. On these 2 documents are from Newport, Rhode Island. Remember, it was part of the slave trade. The document on the left is easy to read, right? That's an indenture. This is an indenture for a certain Carolina Indian named Boca. He was brought from Carolina. If you read about the history of the Carolinas, they had something called the Yamasee Wars, where the colonists in the Carolinas attacked the indigenous people, took their land, and sold their citizens or the people who belonged to the tribal groups into slavery. Many of them were sent north. People in New England didn't want Carolina Indians. They really didn't do what the New Englanders wanted. The problem with indigenous people, indigenous men as enslaved people, if you gave them an axe and told them to cut down a tree, if they didn't use the axe against you, they probably just took off and left. The forest was their highway. The rivers was their interstate. So to them, it wasn't. Whereas for the British or the white colonists, as well as many of the African colonists, the forest was kind of a scary place. But it says, here's Boca. He was a Carolina Indian. He's 25 years old. He's purchased for a term of 80 years. Because an Indian from the 13 colonies was a subject of the crown and could not be enslaved for life. And their children couldn't be enslaved, so they worked their way around the rules. So he followed the letter of the law. He wasn't enslaved for life, only for 80 years. And he was already 25 years old. On the right was a document. It still bothers me today to think about it, because I started this project with 12 and 13-year-olds. And this document on the right from Newport, Rhode Island, is a sale to Charles Caldwell of a certain, I'm going to use my pointer here, right here. A sale to Charles Caldwell of a certain Negro girl named Phyllis, about 10 years of age. And this is dated 1746. So 1746, this girl, 10 years of age, might have been born in Africa, brought to the West Indies, brought in captivity to Newport, Rhode Island, and then being sold to Charles Caldwell, who's bringing her to Connecticut. How terrifying is that? How traumatic is that for this 10-year-old girl? If we stop thinking of her as a slave, but think of her as a 10-year-old girl, that's the part of this project that hits me even today. And sometimes I read something, it's a little bit of a gut punch, and that's a gut punch to me because I'm seeing, I think when I started the project, my daughter was like 16, and I'm thinking, what about her? And there are places in the world today, right? There are places in the world today where awful things are happening to 10-year-old girls and 10-year-old boys and women and children. And we're blessed that it's not happening here today, but it happened here in our cultural ancestors were part of the purchase of these enslaved people. Not necessarily our personal ancestors, but our cultural ancestors. So in Massachusetts, where do you find evidence? So you can find it at different places. In Longmeadow, we have the church records. We have people like Melissa who help us find this information. But the church records here talks about Icus, a Negro and servant to Thomas Field, was admitted to the church in 1741. That Caesar, a Negro servant to Captain George Colton, was admitted to the church. We have a lot of people of African descent admitted to the church in the late 1730s and early 1740s, and it's associated with the Great Awakening. George Whitefield, a guy named Jonathan Edwards, I don't know if you heard of him, and others were crossing the area and having these big revival church meetings and telling the pastors, you need to bring everybody to church. So they started bringing their enslaved people to the church to get baptized and own the covenant and become church members. For researchers, you're like, wow, look at all the enslaved people in 1741 in this community. But then you realize it's the same amount of people as before, they just happen to be baptizing them. But the churches give us these records. We also find vital records. In the right from Gloucester, Massachusetts, we have the vital records, and it shows lists of enslaved people. People who indexed this, maybe in the 1930s, separated out the people of color. We're not sure why, but they did. But it's helpful for us today. It's a little, maybe a little racist then. But by doing so, we can see that Caesar was a servant of Elias Davis, and he was baptized in 1732. And there's another Caesar, son of Caesar, who was baptized in 1763, so that might be that Caesar's son. And we can look through and see names alphabetized by first names. Why are they alphabetized by first names? Because if you weren't a full member of society, you didn't need a last name. If you couldn't buy and sell property, you didn't need a last name. If somebody else was deciding sometimes even who you married or where your children would be sold to, you didn't need a last name. So sometimes the only way we can connect people is through these documents that give us multiple first names. We have in Massachusetts something called the 1754 slave census. It doesn't give us names, but it gives us numbers by communities who responded to the census. It's a little tricky because guess which town wasn't a town in 1754? Longmeadow. So there's a lot of towns in Massachusetts that weren't a town, and there's a lot of counties that weren't counties. So you were saying that you were Hampshire. This was Hampshire County. So if you're looking under Hampshire County, we're Hampden County now, but you could see that the records aren't all clear. But if you go there and start putting in communities, it'll give you some information, but the town I grew up in, Southbridge, wasn't a town until 1816. So it's not going to show up there of having enslaved people because slavery ended in 1783. But the neighboring community, Sturbridge, which was around during the colonial time, might have enslaved people, and those enslaved people might have lived in what is now Southbridge. But that takes a lot of extra work. Where else did slaves live? Now, I go back to where the project started in Guilford, and Lyman Beecher was being interviewed by his daughter in his autobiography. So it sounds like a funny autobiography that is interviews, but that's part of it. He was talking about how the people were taxed during the American Revolution, that the Board of Selectmen would come around and say, I need 2 sides of beef, I need this and that. And he said, if we had slaves, we'd be ruined. Because enslaved people were super valuable. They were probably the next most valuable thing after people's houses and property, the land. They were the next most valuable thing. So he says, so she asked her dad, were not there some who held slaves? And Lyman Beecher, Harriet's father, said, yes, yes, a few. Darb the fiddler was a slave, belonged to old Ben Rossiter. Darb came in one evening, played dancing tunes after I was abed. There were about a dozen slaves in North Guilford, but slavery was very lenient. He went on to say, old priest Fowler's Moses was quite the man of business, sent Johnny Fowler to college, paid the bills, managed a farm, rung the church bell, was a factotum. I had to look up that word. It means jack of all trades, and lived a slave because he was king. If you read those last 3 lines, if you're anything like me, it's like, how is an enslaved person a king? How is an enslaved person running the farm and paying the bills? How did he send Amos Fowler's son, John Fowler, to Yale? How did he pay his tuition? But that's the thing about slavery is I say slavery is different in every region, every state, every county, every town, and every household. But in Connecticut, in Rhode Island, in parts of eastern Massachusetts, there were people elected by the local enslaved people as slave kings and governors. And Moses was one of them. Just so happens, Pat Wilson Phineas, not just so happens, it's not a coincidence, but Pat Wilson Phineas, who will be coming here to speak, that's her uncle. That's like her 4th grade uncle, Moses. And she looks at that and says, this is a story about my family prior to the American Revolution. How many descendants of enslaved people have stories about their family prior to the American Revolution? But this is an amazing story. Where do we find it? Not in the archives, but in an anecdote, in an autobiography. And we don't believe everything about this. I wouldn't say slavery in the North was lenient. If the children of enslaved women were mixed race, that's not lenient. If children were sold away from their parents, that's not lenient. If enslaved people were hogtied and whipped for minor crimes, that's not lenient. So lenient is in the eye of the beholder, or maybe an excuse of it wasn't so bad here. Everybody did it. It wasn't against the law, but it doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make it easy or fair. You know, the argument about it was okay because it was legal. It's legal in Connecticut to take all your money, to take your rent or your grocery money and go to the casino and not feed your children properly that week. It's legal, but it's still wrong. It's legal to do a lot of things, and it's still wrong. So we have to understand the difference. I come into Massachusetts. I don't see it on Route 5, but what are the big billboards now coming into Springfield? You know, Green Acres or so on and so forth, selling marijuana to oftentimes to young people who maybe have a better place to spend that money. That's me being judgmental because I'm not a big marijuana user, or I'm not a marijuana user at all. But seeing that one of the biggest advertisements coming into Massachusetts from Connecticut now are the weed factories. It's legal. That doesn't make it right. So we have to remember that things that are legal aren't necessarily morally right. Well, we got the pastor here. I can let him explain a little more about that. Yes. Well, what they didn't do is we didn't have gang labor here. We didn't have a row of enslaved people and a person behind them on a horse with a whip. It was mostly task related or job related. You, Moses, go out and clear the stream that's going into the swamp. You, Moses, go and mow 5 acres today. So it was more task related, which allowed Moses to have some side gigs, right? He was a factotum. I imagine he was like fixing the neighbor's cartwheel, or he was helping to roof the house, or things like that. We have enslaved people who built dams that are still around 300 years later. We have enslaved people who built foundations, houses. We have enslaved people who built churches. So they were doing all the things that their enslavers were doing. They were filling those ships. They were working at the rope walks, these long rope walks to make ropes and doing stuff like that. So they were doing all the industrial things that are here. There were millers and carpenters and joiners and stuff like that. So they were doing all those things, but we didn't have dozens of enslaved people lined up on a field, behind acres of cotton. Some of the towns in Rhode Island, what's that? I don't think we made tobacco that way. Virginia was making tobacco that way. Oh, a miller could run a sawmill, a grist mill, a carding mill, a fuller mill. And in Woodstock, we find that dam that was built by Mimbo was for these little mills along that stream. Animal husbandry required a lot of labor. So if you have a few hundred acres and you're raising horses or cattle or sheep, you might have up to a dozen enslaved people as part of that. Now, the women weren't in the houses dusting. They were taking the corn and husking it and getting it off the cobs. They were helping to process the meat. They were cooking. They were making the cheeses. Think of everybody as part of this factory system of filling those vessels to the West Indies. That's what the enslaved people. And at the Porter Phelps house in, is that Hadley? In Hadley, they started to look at, no, they weren't just dusting or taking care of the kids. The women were part of this factory system, just like my ancestors came to New England and were part of the factory system at a later date. They came to work in the mills. Yes?
When I heard say your name, Ben, we heard some of the documentation from Stephen Williams' diary, and several of the enslaved people were trying to run away, and one even took his own life. So these are examples of not people who felt totally uncomfortable, but people who were demoralized and suffering at the end.
Yeah, and if you see the hundreds of ads in New England of people running away, but it also tells us they were teamsters, weren't they? So Stephen Williams talks about enslaved people bringing a load of something here or a load of something here, and there was one of the Peters didn't necessarily want to come back, so he would take the long way. He's like, well, you've been gone a couple days now. It's like, yeah. My wife says that when I go to Lowe's. It took a long time at Lowe's. I'm like, it looks like you have a fresh coffee too. Anyway, evidence of enslaved people, hard to find. We talked earlier today that there's not evidence in your graveyards of enslaved people, but we know we can guess that they were buried there or on the outskirts of it, on the edges of it. In Guilford, where the project started, we have two, out of all the gravestones, two for enslaved people, both named Shem, different people. One was Shem, owned by Simeon Chittenden. He was a veteran of the American Revolution, and the other Shem was owned by, the guy's last name was Dudley, I forget Nathaniel Dudley. He was a veteran of the French and Indian War. So we have these two gravestones out of the thousands of gravestones we have in the community. Sometimes, rarely do we find enslaved people. The two on the upper right are in Greenwich, Connecticut, and therefore Hester Mead and Candace Bush. Candace is Hester's mother. Candace died probably in the 1820s when slavery was still going on. Hester made enough money in her lifetime to put a stone for herself and her mother, even though I don't think her mother ever gained her freedom. We do have places in some towns that still have old derogatory words, and those get changed. Sometimes they get changed in a way like Walker Pond gets changed and named that. It had a different name before, and it was changed to the name of the first African-American minister in Milford, Connecticut, so we remember, at least it has to do with African-Americans. But sometimes, like North Street in Guilford, you'd never know that was an African-American community. There certainly aren't African-Americans living there today. We don't want the other word that was used to describe the street, but maybe there's another way of doing it so we're not erasing the fact that there were people of color there before. So it's a challenge. I have a friend, Meadow Dibble, up in Maine, who's surveying the names of hills and ponds and streams and creeks and everything else in Maine to take off names that are derogatory to people, either indigenous or African people in Maine. And it's strange when you think about African enslaved people here, Then think about Maine, and you're like, oh crap, but there's a history of enslaved people, African enslaved people in Maine. Now, yes. Yes, but not the bushes. So if you're going down the interstate, if you're going down 95, you'll see a sign for the Bush Holly House. It's those bushes, not the Herman Walker, not the Senator, President Bushes. And they, of course, they're from Greenwich too, aren't they? And Bush is really a Dutch name, B-O-S-C-H. I think some of you, we used to have spark plugs from them back in the day. Nobody? No. I had an Opel Kadett. I had a 68 Opel Kadett. It had all Bosch parts. But, so it's a good question, and we haven't investigated that family, but we have investigated the family of David Bush, who built the Bush Holly House and was considered this great entrepreneur for all the wealth he had. He also had 15 enslaved people. Might have helped him a little bit with that wealth. So we're retelling at the Bush Holly House, part of the Greenwich Historical Society, we're retelling the story of David Bush and his family and talking about Candace and Cole Jr. and Hester and other members of that family. We don't, and maybe somebody here knows better than I do, but I haven't found a narrative from enslaved people in Massachusetts who were enslaved in Massachusetts. So a narrative is a story people talk about. Slave narratives are a type of literature where people talk about their life being enslaved. We don't have one, as far as I know, in Massachusetts, but in Connecticut we have 3. And we use them as well as Sojourner Truth, who's from New York State, to understand what slavery was like in their viewpoint. Because according to the white owners and historians, lenient with many freedoms, paternalistic with masters guiding the morals of slaves, treatment as part of the family, and care for life. But if you read what Venture Smith or James Mars or Jeffrey Brace or Jeremiah Asher, who's writing about his grandfather, Gad Asher, they talk about whippings and beatings and hog tyings, double crossings and cheatings, abandonment of age and youth sold south, and severe punishments for minor crimes. So hearing what they say versus what is said about them really changes our perspective of what slavery was like here. And it doesn't mean every day was awful. It doesn't mean that there was sometimes generosity in a relationship. We have enslaved people, after gaining their freedom, come back and give their inheritance back to the children of their enslavers. We have enslaved people returning to the households where they were enslaved, just like happened in the South. But we have other stories that are really not that pleasant. So we have to remember that the opportunity for awful things to happen was very strong here because of the concept of ownership. I would tell my students, when we would talk about it, I said, do you know why there's laws here about abusing your pets? Because some people, that's the only thing keeping them from being abusive towards their pets. And in places where there wasn't a lot of controls over how people treated their enslaved people, you would have awful things happen. Because people have, I own this, this is mine. Back when I was growing up, you had husbands say that about their wives. Don't tell me how to treat my wife. She's mine. So that's what was happening during the time of slavery. We remember, maybe some of us remember things happening in our neighborhoods, or seeing animals abused, or our neighbors abused, and say, why is that happening? Well, because that person thinks they possess something and you can't tell them what to do. In Massachusetts, unlike a lot of other places, enslaved people oftentimes got their day in court. So that did happen, but it wasn't, but the hardest thing is who's listening and who gets representation. So near the end of slavery, enslaved people got their day in court. And that's how slavery ended in Massachusetts. Didn't end that way in Connecticut or Rhode Island or New York or New Jersey, where I'm working, or even Pennsylvania. But in Massachusetts, the courts began to listen to enslaved people, especially after the Massachusetts state constitution was enacted during the American Revolution. That said something about all men being created equal. And then enslaved people started suing the courts. Mum Betts, one of them, Quack Walker was another, who sued the courts through the help of some white, allies, sued the courts and gained their freedom that way. There's no law. I don't think there was a law in Massachusetts that ended slavery. The courts ended slavery in Massachusetts. You know, we have, and I have it here, the Mumbet case is an example of that. You know, it's places where you find the stories of slavery. David Bush, we were just talking about him from in his inventory, we find his enslaved people being valued only second to his sloop Sally, the sailing ship that he had. We have autobiographies, we have town records, we have census data. Massachusetts, by the time of the U.S. Census, slavery was over, but we still find a large percentage of free blacks living in white households. Is that a little bit of a mirror of what was happening before 1790? I believe we can work our way backwards. It's very time consuming because you have to go back and look at wills and property records and transfers and church records to say, is these three enslaved people, these three free blacks living in this white household, were they enslaved 7 years earlier? It's not, there's no document, there's no emancipations in 1783 in Massachusetts. It just ends. In Connecticut, we have emancipations all the way up to, you know, 1848. So it's a different thing. So this is part of what we talk about. If slavery was critical to development in our country, if slavery shaped our beliefs about race in our country, if slavery was the main cause of the Civil War, now some of your social studies teachers are rolling in their graves when you say that because they told you about tariffs and states' rights. Those are good things, but those were about slavery. If enslaved people resisted their bonds and still contributed to the growth of our country, how can we remember them? And that's what the Witness Stones Project is about. How do we remember enslaved people? We're not here to re-victimize them. We're not here to tell sad, sad stories. We're hopefully here to tell stories of human beings that we can relate to. The project's mission is to restore the history and honor the humanity of enslaved individuals who helped build our communities. That's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to re-victimize them. We want our students to look at the stories of enslaved people and say, oh, I understand why he did that. I understand why she did that, why she resisted. Or maybe we understand why a person did everything they were supposed to do to gain their freedom. There's different things that we see about that. Growing up in Massachusetts, I take kind of what I say here, but I also say, I was taught that slavery, I keep thinking I already said this, but it was this morning, that slavery occurred in the South, that segregation's from the South, that racism's from the South. In growing up in the 1970s, putting on the TV in Massachusetts and watching school buses get tipped over in South Boston, and that the South needs to fix it. What if slavery happened here, and segregation is here, and racism's here? Who's supposed to fix it? It was really easy in the 70s to point south. I'll tell you, I went to boot camp in 1976, and some of the kids from the neighborhood in Philadelphia, they said, where are you from? And I said, well, I'm from Massachusetts. They said, is that near Boston? I said, yeah, pretty close. And they said, they kill N-word people there. Their view of Massachusetts was people turning over buses and killing school children. And I'm from Massachusetts thinking, I'm in Parris Island, South Carolina. These people were evil, right? Think of that. You know, we were still proud of ourselves while in the 70s watching school buses get tipped over. Most of you can't remember that, but there's a couple of you. A couple of you can. So our project, Restore the History, Honor the Humanity of Enslaved Individuals. We do it through research, education, and civic engagement. This civic engagement's wonderful. We're getting you guys and gals to understand our country in the past. Pat Wilson-Phineas is better, and then the students will be betterer, we'll just say. It will even be better than that. So I'm happy you're here and you're getting an introduction, but hearing students process this information, understand it, make meaning from it is so important. In the middle, we see a Stolperstein. Some of you might have been to Central Europe or Germany. And a Stolperstein is a stone that's put in the ground. It's our inspiration, but it's a stone that was put in the ground at places where Jews lived freely before they were kidnapped and murdered during the Holocaust. And this one says, here lived Max Werner. He was born in 1877, deported in 1942 to Theresienstadt. In 1944, he was murdered in Auschwitz. There are over 100,000 Stolperstein or stumbling stones in Central Europe now. When a friend of mine heard about my research, not knowing anything about northern slavery, went to Germany, came back and said, could we remember enslaved people the way Jews are remembered in Central Europe. That was the spark, that was the catalyst. I like to say if you bring a sore knee to a surgeon, they're going to want to operate. You bring an idea to a middle school teacher, they're going to want to make an educational unit. But it helped me understand how I could take this research I did and make it accessible to the students, because the focus is that memorial. You see one on the right for Pompey, who was a carpenter. And we have anecdotes about him doing carpentry work. And he was enslaved in front of the house that he was enslaved at. We put his memorial. We have circa 1775 because we know he lived at that time there, but we also kind of know when he was born. And we know he died in 1819, which made him the last enslaved person in Guilford, Connecticut, because by the 1810 census, there were about 10 enslaved people. By the 1820 census, there were none. So we know that he was the last enslaved person there. And that's in front of his house. So we try to remember him. So we have about 210 witness stone memorials across the Northeast. And I will not live long enough to, to do 100,000 of them. So. Our first presentation was done. Guilford has an 8-acre green if you've ever been down there, and the presentation was on the green. All the middle school students came to the presentation. Local community members sang. The church pastor, she's the one with the thing around her neck, yeah, was there. The state representatives were there. And, you know, we had a whole community come together to understand this project. Phyllis and Montrose happened to be the 6th great grandparents of Pat Wilson Phineas, who will be here. That's our Adam and Eve story. That's the story we use to help us understand slavery. And I'll tell you, so many amazing things happen by understanding Moses and Phyllis and Montrose and Candace and Flora and the whole family. That helped us understand what slavery looked like. Students presented, which is so important. Also, I have a pretty good work cited for Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New England slavery. Whenever you see a book saying New England, it really means Massachusetts, by the way. It's pretty disappointing for us in Connecticut. But there are a lot of great books that were written about it, and there's more stuff, more scholarly work being done every year. This is our board chair, but I'm not going to be able, you'll hear her speak here, but she speaks about how it relates to her. Her dad was a Tuskegee Airman, really an amazing person himself. She was a commissioner of social services in Connecticut, state representative, and she's a lawyer and a social worker. She's an amazing woman. Her son did he was the last person to interview Prince before he died. He helped write the Notorious screenplay, as well as Creed 2 and other things. So he's a big shot on the West Coast. We're trying to get his Rolodex, by the way, so we can find. But this is, and I think, how we're doing for time? Oh, we got another hour. No, just the teachers are like, he could do it too, right? He could do it. So we're going to stop on this slide. And what we did is when we looked at all the documents we collected to try to understand slavery and looked on how we could share it with the students, we came up with these 5 themes. And these themes are so important. And they help us understand slavery. And they help us understand the world around us, don't they? There's no way you can treat someone inhumanely without dehumanizing them first. We know that through Hitler and the Nazis. We know that from the British and the Irish during we just went to have some pub food at the Celtic. But you know what happened to the Irish. If you see the Irish when they came to this country, the drawings of them showed them pretty much dragging their knuckles when they came here. We know that as a teacher, when I first started teaching, someone said, well, that kid's as dumb as an ox. Well, if they're dumb as an ox, I don't have to teach them because they can't learn. But the same kid might talk about their female teacher at home saying, she's a witch. I can't learn from her. She's a witch. She hates me. They might even use a B instead of the W. But that dehumanizes that teacher and says to the child, you absolve yourself from having to learn from them. We absolve ourselves. Sometimes we absolve ourselves from treating immigrants properly. We talk about them crossing the border, being rapists and drug dealers and murderers and gang members, and we put their children in cages. That's happening today. That wasn't during Nazism. That wasn't during the Great Famine. That wasn't during slavery. That's here. Treatment of enslaved, we have to break the myth of good slavery in the North. We have to go from house museum to historical societies to churches and say, oh, Reverend Williams, he was a great guy. He was, except we have to talk about the exceptions. We have to talk about their humanity, how they weren't perfect. Paternalism, certainly, I don't have to speak to the women in the audience about paternalism, how society had, my wife reminds me every once in a while, it's only been a little more than 100 years that women weren't patted on the head and said, oh, don't worry, honey, I'll vote for you. So the paternalism, our kids understand paternalism because they're supposed to be treated like children, less than adults. But what if you're an enslaved person or a free black and you're still treated, told where to live? The banks tell you I can't give you a loan because you're trying to move into the wrong neighborhood, which was the right neighborhood. So paternalism happened then, happens now. Economics of freedom and slavery. Anybody study economics? Yeah, it ruins everything, doesn't it? Because you start looking at the world, oh, that was a wonderful moral decision they made. No, it has to do with the Benjamin. It has to do with the money. And economics during the time of slavery was super important. And so when you see something good happen, I always look around the corner and say, but how is that enslaver benefiting from that? By freeing that person, how are they benefiting from it? So economics helps us understand why slavery happened. Slavery didn't happen because people just wanted to have extra people around. Somebody was making, in many cases, a boatload of money doing this. But the most important themes are agency and resistance. We're trying to show the humanity of enslaved people. So we're trying to show that some of them ran away. Some of them did everything right to gain their freedom. Some of them poisoned their enslavers. Some of them gained skills and taught them to their children. Some had children to keep the family going, and some didn't have children to keep them away from slavery. We're not here to judge. We know that some people from New England, African American people, fought on the side of the British to gain their freedom. That's as much agency as fighting on the side of the Americans to gain your freedom too. I never could understand why people say, oh, they fought for the country. I'm like, you're enslaved. One side's offering you your freedom, and the other side's saying, well, I might give you your freedom if you fight for us. It's like, to me, it wasn't like, oh, let's raise the flag. And I was in the service, so I'm a patriotic guy. But we're not here to judge people's agency or their resistance or what choices they made, but we're here to amplify them, to say these are human beings that made choices that maybe you would make and you wouldn't, or she would make and she wouldn't. So that's part of what we're seeing through this project. And I'm going to just go real quick so don't get blind. So this is mainly, I love this memorial for Latouche. She was freed twice. We found over a half dozen people who were freed twice. But we're here trying to, for the students, having them become consumers and producers of information literacy, collaborate, communicate, present individual and shared understandings, and build a foundation to discuss hard history towards a path and truth and reconciliation. In this country, if you go to Germany, if you go to South Africa, if you go to many other countries, they've worked on truth and reconciliation. We are still struggling with the truth. We are really struggling with the truth. So this is just a little part of it, but imagine if a lot of organizations and schools and communities and churches did a little part of it, that we would have an opportunity to really have some meaningful discussions about our country's past and our future. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm happy to take any questions, or if you want to come up after and chat, I'm happy to do that too. So. Any questions, or did I wear you all out? Okay.
Thank you, Dennis. We appreciate it. It was interesting. I called Phyllis just to arrange for her to come and speak at that date, and we ended up talking for over an hour. It was incredible. She's just has a powerful story. She said the work that Dennis did enabled her to learn about her family in a way that she even feels more American as a result of her experience learning, because it connected her to her past that was here. There's a movie I saw on The Hidden History. It's actually called The Burial. And at one point they break out and they talk about how this whole field in the South was a slave burial ground. And there were no symbols of the lives of these people that lasted. So often graves were marked with wood or not marked at all. And they talk about how one history is being laid over another history. And so in a lot of ways, the stones remember people who weren't remembered. And we'll be placing 2 stones out in front of our memorial garden right next to the sidewalk on Long Meadow Street. Not right in front of the church, but just in front of the gardens. And that's what the May date is about, and then the April date is about Phyllis coming to speak. So I'm really glad. I didn't know. We tried to get the word out as much as possible. Really glad that all of you have responded in the way that you have. Yes, Mary.
Okay. Sure. I don't have much to say. Yeah, so the question is, what are we doing in the school? So right now, we're training the teachers to bring this curriculum with the 5 themes into the classroom with the students, so they get up to understand the 5 themes, looking at primary documents associated with Massachusetts. And then the next big piece is they're going to be using those same 5 themes to excavate, to extract information about Phyllis and Peter, and then to write narrative nonfiction biographical sketches, otherwise known as short biographies, about enslaved people, and maybe poetry, and maybe reflective pieces, and maybe artwork. So that's what we're doing in the classroom. I'm not teaching the kids in Long Meadow. Their teachers are, but we're trying to transfer the curriculum to them, and then hopefully year after year they can continually use work from that's already been done or will continue to be done at the Historical Society to tell other stories too.
We have one middle school student already here, so he's a few steps ahead. Again, we have one more question in the back. This has been live streamed. Okay, so it is available on YouTube on our church. If you go to First Church of Christ Long Meadows our YouTube page, it will be available. Stan will work on merging the slides with the video as well. So. Thank you again. Really appreciate it. If you're interested in any of the future programs, Marilyn in the back has a sign-up sheet. If you'd like to leave your email addresses, we'll remind you of what's coming up. So thanks.